Before we go into the session, I'd like firstly to invite each of our panellists to introduce themselves. Sharon, would you like to kick us off?
Hi, I'm Sharon Harrison-Barker and I'm the Secretary and Registrar at the University of Hertfordshire.
I'm Sian Waring, I'm Vice-Chancellor at Middlesex University, and I'm just to let you know I'm quite hard of hearing, so I miss things, so if I look a bit blank, just repeat them.
And I'm Aya Ferguson. You saw my picture earlier. I don't look like that anymore. I'm recent Head of Consulting at SAMS.
Thank you. So we've heard today a lot about how the sector is feeling under a huge amount of pressure at the moment. Many commentators have described it as a perfect storm, but in truth, people have been talking about the perfect storm in higher education for as long as I've worked in the sector, all the way back to the Brown Review in 2010. So what is going on now? Is it really different? Should we believe the hype? Is this really an existential crisis for universities? In reality, the funding challenges are very, very harsh, very, very real. Income staying mostly flat for people, costs are rising. We've heard today already many times, 40% of institutions are forecasting a deficit this year. So that, coupled with changing student demands and a growing regulatory burden, that does really feel like a confluence of really trying challenges all at the same time. But while it might have felt very challenging, particularly over the last 10 years or so, the first quarter of this century was in fact actually pretty kind to the higher education sector in the UK. We've had lots of income growth over that period. Trouble is, we're perceived as a sector as being knowingly and willfully inefficient. The ministerial letter that's just gone to universities in the last couple of weeks cited the need for sustained efficiency and reform. Government knows it. That's why they're not going to just give us loads of extra money. They want us to get our house in order first. The money might follow. But, there's lots and lots of challenges in order for us to get there. If we think, actually, about the last 5 years, on a geopolitical level, the last 5 years have seen absolutely seismic change. It has been more volatile, more unpredictable than any period in certainly my lifetime. It began with Boris Johnson winning a massive majority at the 2019 election. But in the blink of an eye, we entered into a global pandemic, virtually shut down the world for 2 years. What followed? Opportunistic war in Ukraine, driving up inflation even higher on the back of COVID. And at the end of the period, the October the 7th attacks, leaving the Middle East, perhaps the world, on the brink of war. And then finally, a Labour landslide at the 2024 election. Lots of huge change. But if we look at HE over that 5-year period, how much did we change? Actually, not that much is the reality. We talk a lot about the need to change, about the need to make savings, and we've heard how many universities are making job cuts or thinking about making job cuts at the moment. But if you look at the data, if you look into the data, in raw terms, we as a sector employ more administrators than we did in 2019. If you look at administrators as a proportion of the HE workforce, it's barely moved at all. The dial is pretty much in the same place. There are costs to cut in some places. Not every institution is the same. I do appreciate that. We should all be looking at where we can make efficiencies. Pay, non-pay, the lot. But whether or not we as an institution, at an institutional level, have a burning platform or not, we do need to make changes. We do need to grasp the nettle. You can't, though, as we've heard many, many times over the years, just cut your way to strategic success. Cutting needs to be carefully done, and it needs to be balanced against income growth, income diversification. That's the other big agenda. And we've been talking today is all about that difficult balance. How can you do both? How could you do both at the same time? And indeed, where can you find the time, the space, the resources to tackle the change agenda while doing the day job? So those are the big questions. And indeed, if we think about the biggest question of all, the question that today is all about, is it possible to balance the two? Cut costs to survive, grow income to thrive. That's the challenge. That's what I want our panel to think about in the first instance. I want them to think about the ultimate balancing act. So, panel, do you think it's possible for a university to successfully cut costs and grow income at the same time? Actually, for this one, I'm just going to run down the line. So you're in the box seat here, Sharon.
Thank you. I'm going to change the question slightly.
I used to do that in my A-levels.
I will come round to it. But thank you. I think there were some other questions in your opening address, Joel, which was around, is it really different? What's going on now? Should we believe the hype? Is it an existential crisis for universities? I have to say, I'm coming from Hertfordshire, and it might just be me because I'm retiring in a couple of years, but I'm feeling quite optimistic. And I know that isn't usual, when I'm going round and networking, but I genuinely am feeling quite optimistic. But that might just be me. It's my natural state. So you have to tell me when to panic, because otherwise I don't. So I need to come and do that. But I think it does feel different. I think it genuinely does feel different this time. Maybe I thought that last time too. It's definitely financial crisis of what people are doing, what the deficits are this year, or reduced surpluses are this year. It's definitely talk of the town wherever you go. I'm sure you've been talking about it on your table, about what's going on in your institutions. And the scale of the challenge across all mission groups feels different this time. I think before I've seen it in certain mission groups and certain types of institutions, but I think it feels more spread this time than I've seen it before. And that will be worrying for a post-92 institution, because certainly if universities from other mission groups decide to grow, you eat our lunch. There's no doubt about that. And we feel the genuine pain of that. And I do think, probably for the first time in my career, I think it is genuinely likely that a university will fail due to a financial crisis. And I think that's as much about the context, so as much about the banks pulling or not loaning, or I think there's been ways to get out of this before. And I think that many of us have also been, that horrible phrase of kind of squeezing the orange for quite some time, and it's how much is left in there that we can do. Now, clearly, based on the conversations we've already been having today about procurement, about shared services, about all of that other stuff, there's always more, but how much of it will come through. I think we've had the perfect storm of a declining demand, high fixed cost, high inflation, governmental influence, but I do think the rhetoric has changed positively, and I think that makes a big difference on the international stage. It was noting earlier, we were talking about Australia and Canada. I don't know if we mentioned it this morning. I heard, I was on a panel yesterday, another event, and Vice Chancellor was on that panel, was saying that actually Donald Trump had said that he would give a green card to international students. Well, if that's true and happens, that's quite a game changer, I think, because we saw a Trump bounce last time. We saw a positive bounce from the Trump election. I'm not sure that's going to happen this time. But I think we are starting to discuss for the first time doing less with less, where we've discussed before doing more with the same, or trying to do it. I think we're coming to the first real conversations of doing less with less and trying to decide what we would do about that. And some of the challenges for an institution like mine are that where we do want to diversify, we want to grow income, many of the things that you start doing are financial loss makers. So degree apprenticeships, fantastic, aren't they? We all agree with them. Why wouldn't we? Wouldn't we be asking our own children to go into them if they're at that age? Because they're fantastic. They're not money-making for an institution like mine until we get an absolute mass, but you've got to invest first to get to that. The same with online. You've got to invest. It's a completely new way of teaching, a new way of supporting students, so you've got to get to a mass. And have we got the time and money to invest? Traditional research institutions, the not getting full cost back for research. I'm sure there's conversations going on like that in institutions where there's more research. We saw foundation degree fees be reduced last week. And obviously for students, again, that's good news and hopefully will bring more students in, but that's still going to impact on, one, whether we offer foundation degrees, and two, the income that we get from them. let me come on a bit to Hertfordshire to set a bit of context. We're an institution, we've posted surpluses over the last 3 years, 22 million, 23 million, 17 million. We're expecting to have a surplus this year. We've had no borrowing over 12 years, growth in students, £50 million growth in turnover over the last 3 years. We're in sound financial health, but we can't in any single year take our eye off the ball. We have to deal with our challenges in year and not on an ongoing basis. And so just a couple of bits that might be a little bit different about us in terms of that growing out of it. I strongly believe, because I've got this optimistic outlook, even despite all the things I've been saying, is that we have to be really careful how much we cut, because I think we've got an opportunity to fly out of this. And there's some holding position, and we're in a situation where we probably can do that. And I know some other institutions aren't in those situations. It would be really culturally interesting at my institution. I know we've got some colleagues in the room, ex-colleagues and current colleagues. We haven't had a redundancy round in over 20 years since I've been there. I've been there 23 years. We've had some individual redundancies where we might have stopped a programme or stopped an area, but no VR, no big mass programme. So that would be culturally really interesting for us to go through. We also have some areas that others might not have. So we have... people will know that our previous strategy mantra was we're business facing, and people will often say that to me, you're a business facing institution. That means that we run some businesses. I think we're the only university in the country that run a bus company. That sounds great, but when you've got fuel increases, you've got all the things that go around that, you have to hedge fund your fuel, you have to all the things that a big business would do. So we are sometimes carrying losses. When there's surpluses, they come in and help us. So there are opportunities to grow in that space. Things like we've had to be very across the £2, £3 fare that others just won't have had to think about and what that means. We have a sports village. We run at Zemplus, which is the small to medium enterprise businesses around us. So we've tried to diversify our income. So if you see our pie chart of income, it often comes from different places to many other universities because we run these businesses alongside as going concerns, and they have to wash their own face, and we would expect that. I think the other thing, just to finish off, is that, and I'd be interested in speaking to colleagues about this, I think that we've always had a fairly financially literate people within our staff team. And what I mean by that is I honestly think if you walk across our campus and said, what surplus do you need to make? Most people will give you a mantra. We've always had this £10 million mantra. It needs to increase because our turnover's increased, but in general people understand, our staff understand that we are expecting to make a surplus in any year, and we can talk about that quite openly because it's been there for the last 10 years, and I think everybody understands that. So maybe I'll leave it there, but we have some really tight rules and prudent day-to-day management to the extent was, and this really isn't a joke, travel, even for the VC to get business class is not easy in our institution. For the VC to get a new computer or laptop is not easy in our institution. They would go through the same procurement rules and do the same things as everyone else, and we try to live by that. So we have squeezed the orange, and I'll come on a bit more about that when we go forward.
That's great. Thanks, Sharon. Really interesting number of comments there that we can come back to later, but particularly interested in the fact that you've already diversified your income, and that brings with it challenges, but it's also a really helpful basis for a thriving organisation. But also that those tight fiscal rules and financial literacy, that sounds very, very interesting as a cultural piece. Sian.
Thank you. So it's a caveated yes from me. I think the conditions that we need to cut costs and grow successfully are vision, plan and discipline. So I think we heard some of that already. I don't think there will be a bailout, and I think there is a price to autonomy. So we're an autonomous institution that gives us all sorts of freedoms and benefits, and I think the price of that is responsibility for our finances. So as I said, I'm at Middlesex University. Previously I was at University of Northampton, London South Bank before that. So I've worked at a lot of post-92s in executive roles, and I've seen a lot of different finances actually and different approaches to them. So at Middlesex we are on a programme of work to reduce costs, and I'm not necessarily talking about growth, I'm talking about stabilising income, and I am talking about growing income, but it's not necessarily growth in the sense of student numbers, but I'll come on to that. I expect our programme of work to be successful. I think different universities have different challenges and there's different opportunities. So it's not a universal yes. I don't think we will necessarily see a contracted sector, but I do think we will see a shift in operating efficiency and focus. I don't necessarily think fewer UK students will seek higher education, but we may see a change in the patterns of who goes and where they go. So I expect us to make more data-informed decisions and have a different and more professional approach to leadership and governance, because I think if I look at how we found ourselves where we are, we might look at a whole set of decisions that led to that, and I would expect us to be revisiting that and thinking, could we have got somewhere different, and what would it have taken to get somewhere different? I expect us to be ever more responsive to student and employer needs, but I think there are aspects of our current provision which will continue to be valued and to be maintained. So I think face-to-face provision will continue to be valued. I think people will seek it out. And when face-to-face provision isn't possible, people will absolutely take online distance courses. But I don't think it'll be the first choice, because I think learning is really tough and you need to be supported, you need all sorts of structures around you, and they are easier to find in face-to-face contexts, and that will produce better outcomes, not because it's intrinsically better that there's lots of wonderful online and distance learning, but because I think people need that sort of structure, and we can see that. We can see that education doesn't succeed all the time. It's hard for people. So I think face-to-face provision will always be valued, even alongside other kinds of provision, and that coherent degree programmes that are transformative rather than transactional will be valued. Even alongside other kinds of provision like micro-credentials. I think the concept of graduateness and graduate work will be valued, and people will seek it for themselves and for their children. People will want the access to professions and long-term careers and the options that brings. So I think if we understand that opportunity and respond to it, we can cut costs and grow income.
Terrific. Thank you, Sian. There's some really interesting comments there about transformative learning and the value of education, but some also really helpful commentary on the need for us to professionalise our institutions as businesses, that sense of discipline, data-informed decision-making, all those good things that the sector likes to talk about, but sometimes doesn't put into practice. So, yeah, very helpful. Thank you. How about you, Aya?
So I guess I'm probably coming at it from a slightly different perspective. I've spent the last decade or so in various different roles at universities in a sort of transformation, change and improvement role most of the time. So I'm coming at it from a continuous improvement perspective, I guess. And I absolutely think it's possible to cut costs and grow at the same time. Or in other words, it's possible to do more with less, which is often the sort of criticism you get. Or in other words, again, to improve the customer or user experience, whether that's our students or our researchers or our PS staff, to improve their experience without throwing more resource at it, which is often what we're challenged to do. You know, if you're asking us to do this, we need to throw more resource at it. I think it is absolutely possible, but it does require a big shift in mindset and in skill set that is sort of that unified and relentless focus on the things that matter and stop doing the things that don't matter. So really understanding the things that make a difference to our students and our academics and our PS colleagues, and not sweating the other stuff and stopping it. And I think that's often the challenge, that we don't stop the other activity because it's pet projects or it's, that's also really important. We talk about change fatigue, and often I get leaders nodding and saying, yes, that's, we want to do less so that we get more benefit, but we don't actually stop doing those things. So for me it is, there's a finite amount of money. We have to spend it on the bits of our work that actually makes a difference to our sector and to our customers or our users. That's why we exist. So we need as you said, we need the data and insight to make those decisions, those tough decisions actually, on what is it we're going to spend our time on. And then we need leadership aligned around what those priorities are. And I'd probably challenge you, Sharon, and say I'm not sure we have squeezed that orange. We might have chopped it up a bit and sucked a bit at some of the wedges, but I don't think we have squeezed it or at least not squeezed it in a consistent way with that kind of same focus. So yes, I think it is possible, but there's a massive culture change that's needed for it.
Indeed. No, thank you, Aya. So lots of interesting things there as well, that sense of optimism that we should be able to do more with less, particularly if we focus on the user experience and the things that really make a difference to our constituents in terms of university community. Okay, so I hope that has piqued your interest, whetted your appetites as an audience. I've got a flight of questions to get our panellists into greater depth, but then I'm going to come to you as an audience and try and get your questions. So do be thinking, and there will be some roving mics at the ready. But before we do that, let's go through our first flight of questions. So I'm going to throw this one at you, Sian. You've worked in a wide range of institutions, as we've talked about over the course of your career. Some smaller, some larger, some a little bit more research intensive, some less so. As someone who's now responsible for leading strategy development, for leading change at your institution, what's your approach to building your university culture and galvanising the Middlesex community to both see the need for and commit to delivering change?
Thank you. So I find it really helpful to take a long view, and if I can't make it work, I take a longer view.
Write that one down. That is real gold.
So we've already had a mention of COVID, and we've had a mention of Ukraine, and I'm struck by how hard we find change. And yet, all around us, we see the evidence of radical change in the past and the present. So, COVID recently, I am amazed how universities in Ukraine continue to strive to offer HE. And when I walk into work and people say this is hard, I'm like, but people like us are being bombed, and they're still doing it. Not that what we're doing isn't hard, but you can look around and see people who are doing something in situations which are much harder than this. And closer to hand here, if you go back 100 years or so, most of our universities were teacher training colleges, art and design colleges, technical colleges. Sometimes I think in 100 years' time people will still be complaining that we changed a committee, here, or we wouldn't let this happen. But if you think, 100 years ago, we were multiple institutions, and somehow that transformation happened, and we've got what now seems incredibly stable, but it isn't stable. You look around, it has changed before, it will change again. So I try to hope when I'm being challenged as a leader, and by sometimes recurrent ideas that come forth. However, I think we might have engaged in the challenge and moved on. I think, but it will change. The evidence of a changing world is around us. So the next thing I do is let's not think about how to stay the same in a changing world. Let's look at those changes as opportunities. So what opportunities does today's world offer and tomorrow's world offer that we haven't had before? And what might HE look like if we embrace those changes and reimagine ourselves for them? So it's a mindset challenge. So I'm not always successful in this, of course, but I think about what I can see that I think will be constant in the world in 20 or 30 years' time and try and work backwards so we can imagine the steps from here to there. And it helps lift me above the noise. The future will come whether we like it or not. It will come whether we aid it or obstruct it. At the minute, I feel like I've got enough room that I can determine our future. I think if we don't seize that moment, we won't have that room. We'll be out of road. I did one of those driving courses that if you've been 2 miles an hour over the speed limit, you get sent on. And to summarise the challenges that you have when you're driving, it's you run out of time or you run out of road. I think at the moment in the sector we've still got enough resource, but there will be a time when we run out of time and we run out of road. So I'd rather be ahead of that. So working with staff, I think we need to make that long-term future seem real, not just hypothetical, to focus on what's desirable in it and something we want to work towards. Some people find that more challenging than others. Some people find it exciting, some people find it impossible, I think. I try to set up projects that will let people work on what the change might look like for them so that they've got an investment in it. And I think as leaders, we have to think about that what's in it for me test. And when I've done this before successfully, I've said to people, we can sit here till the future hits us and we're out of choices and we're no longer employable because we don't have the skills we need and we haven't done the things we needed to do. Or we can step into it and start to redesign for it. And at that point, you are highly skilled, you are highly desirable as an employee because you've done something people around you haven't done. You can offer them the experience of having redesigned the provision that you currently work in. So we may not do this provision anymore, but you are still employable. And then I let that sit for a bit. And then I watch people step forward to take part in workshops and change activity. So I think engaging people as much as possible in planning and designing the changes is a really important aspect of navigating change successfully. And I think people need to be invested in that future, and we need to empathise with what's frightening about it, but also help people step into it. So something else we're doing is, we've just started, my colleague is here, so you can do a reality check with her, with Sinead later on. But we're starting to talk explicitly about culture, what we believe it is, what we think our status quo is, what our target culture is, and how we're going to make that journey. And for lots of people, it's the first time we've had that conversation. So it brings to light a lot of underlying assumptions. But I think you have to get those assumptions out, you have to talk about them. It has to feel safe, and it has to be exciting.
No, that's terrific. Thank you, Sian. And that sense of the importance of engagement in empowering people, in giving people agency to find those opportunities, to shape the university culture going forwards is really, really powerful. And it certainly echoes the comments made by David and Bar from BCU this morning. So yeah, really, really powerful. And whilst we're on the subject of culture, I'm going to turn to Sharon, because I very much recognise, and I hear it in some institutions more than others, but when times get tough, that them and us schism, that slight sense of academics versus professional services does come to the surface a little bit more when times are tough. So I'd just be really interested in your take as a senior professional services leader for many, many years. How do you get that sense of we're all in it together? How do you get the professional services to recognise that they're there? They wouldn't be there without the academics. They're there to support the academic mission. So collaboration between them is absolutely essential to drive change. Hertfordshire's in a good place. How have you managed it?
Well, we just ask the academics to do as they're told.
Yes. Again, that's another one for the notes, people.
No. I mean, in terms of my own peer group, particularly to start with, there absolutely has to be collective responsibility in the senior leadership team. We go in every Friday to our Vice-Chancellor Executive. We have to come out with an agreed position, regardless of discussions that might have gone on in that room. And so we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with each other, and particularly for me with Deputy Vice-Chancellor, that's who I would work most closely with in terms of operationalising any ideas that have come out, any decisions. And that includes the whole of through the academic year. So I sit with her, Maury Watson, on planning, on portfolio review, we read every staff comms, and we do joint staff Q&As all year. And so we work as a team, and that's important because she's going to hear things coming through from academic colleagues for some of the academic meetings that she's in, and then I'm going to hear it from professional teams and from my head service, and we try and bring those things together. In terms of, for me, fundamental for me has been around taking responsibility for the remit of the areas that come into my realm, and we are an overhead. Right, we have to absolutely understand that. We are an overhead. And so I try to give the challenge to my professional head teams to say, if I was giving £1 million to that dean, would he buy your service? If he had a choice, and he could go to the university next door, or more likely to the local government office next door, or to the school trust office next door, and this kind of comes to that shared services point, I think we might have some things more in common with some of the local government or or a school trust or our mission group rather than the university that's next to us or regionally near us, if I gave him that money, or I say it's a he, it's a dean, it's got to be a he, isn't it? If I give them that money, would they buy your service? And I think if you think about that, and if you think about that internally about whether you would buy their service, and you start to have that kind of internal narrative about it, you start to think about who the customer is and how you want to be. And I think we've got to get to a point, and this is a very kind of American way of saying it, but I was with some Australian universities and they talk about being customer obsessed. So not customer focused, not student focused, customer obsessed. That's what Amazon are. That's what, you know, the latest technology companies are. It's all about that, thinking about how somebody's using your service. So if I think about that around the areas that come under me around the HR service, and how efficiently we can recruit staff, our workforce planning, reward and performance. These are things like performance management we shouldn't be shirking. You know, these are all things that are going to drive where you don't have to go for additional income if you can drive resources internally. Library and computing services comes under me. We've got kind of small steps of change, trying to find operational efficiencies, but then the large projects. So how well are we landing our large IT projects? We're about to go into a student system implementation, pray for me, and how can we land that on time, on budget? Because that's very impactful for the university. And then within academic registry, the efficiency of the processes, how we're developing an effective workforce. And then finally, something I think we haven't talked about too much today, but is our governance fit for purpose? And I mean right from the governors. So have we got the governors that can help us drive change? When we're seeing issues in institutions, I often want to say, where are the governors? Where are the governors? What's happened here? Have they got the right skills to help us, to support us, to challenge us, to make sure that we are a successful institution? Are they challenging the senior executives enough to make sure? And then, likewise, challenging ourselves to make sure that our internal governance, so like all institutions, we're very committee-based. I really think we're going to have to change that. I really think that our committees are going to have to become meet more often, less people, drive change, drive decisions, because you can often be waiting an academic year to get, you had a really good idea, you've even forgotten what it is by the time you get to the committee a year later. So I think we've got to become much quicker, much more paced, and that's all within our gift. We don't have to do anything, it's just cultural. Cultural.
Yes, yeah. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But that sense, again, in its own way, you're talking about the same themes as Sian. This is about professionalisation of our organisations, which is really powerful. And in particular, that critical question, you know, would you buy it if you didn't have to about our services? That is a very, very big and challenging question. It does take me back very, very briefly. I know we haven't got a huge amount of time, but I did once interview a Deputy Vice-Chancellor as part of a target operating model design of professional services in a research intensive. And when he worked out that there were as many academics as there were professional services staff, it was a 50-50 split, his solution was to, just allocate one to every academic, and that's your answer. Okay, just one more question from me before I come to the floor, and this one's for you, Aya. And I am very conscious that when we do work with universities, we normally hand over at the point of recommendations. And when we go back, we explore impact. We sometimes find that not all of those recommendations have been implemented, and not because they don't want to or they've changed their minds, but sometimes they just don't have the headspace or the resource base to do it all, particularly when you're talking to smaller institutions or institutions that haven't got a strategic transformation office or a PMO. So how can universities best deliver change without having to hire an army of change practitioners?
So this is a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? Because we'd like to carry on delivering recommendations of them to be implemented. But I think it comes back to the kind of mindset and culture that David talked about in his keynote speech, and you've alluded to as well, Sian. A lot of the time, change is seen as a negative and something that's sort of imposed on us by government or by sector pressures and you know the environment that's around. And I kind of think we need to change the narrative so both our PS colleagues and academics see it as their role to protect our amazing and precious sector, but not by protecting it from change, but actually by embracing and almost defining what that future looks like. So not trying to protect the status quo, but actually defining that future that you talked about, Sian, and striving towards it in everything that we do. So we need to see the future as it's inevitable, but it's exciting rather than scary, and it's something that we've defined and we want to be part of defining, rather than sort of just being a hostage to fortune and others defining it for us. So for me, again, it means leadership, leading that vision, but actually also, I mean, it was very inspiring hearing David talking about that bottom-up approach to what the vision could be, and then empowering colleagues to make it happen. And I guess really embracing people who might know what that future looks like. And we all talk about having 5-year strategies. By the time you get to have delivered it's out of date. You know, that we need 30-year strategies, because actually, by the time we build it, it will be too small, or it will not be appropriate anymore. So there's something about that visioning and how we make sure that we're doing the right things, and that's about empowering colleagues to help being part of what that vision looks like. But it also means that they, ensuring that our colleagues have the knowledge and skills to be able to navigate and implement change. And for all of my change colleagues in here, maybe cover your ears now because you won't like me saying this, but it's not rocket science. Change management is not rocket science. What it means, I mean, anybody can be a good change practitioner if you understand where you're headed, you understand where you're coming from, what the context is, and above all, you care about supporting people through that journey. That's what it is. That's not rocket science, but we have to really want it, and we have to really want to support people through it and empower them to do it. So I'm sure we've all witnessed lots and lots of change projects where it feels like it's being done to you, and then you have a less than successful benefit realization of some of those projects. So for me, it's about empowering people and then just get out of their way. Actually let them crack on with it. And just to your point, Joel, of what does that mean for smaller institutions who maybe don't have the resources? I don't think we need to throw lots of resources at it. Maybe we need a little bit less governance and a little bit less hierarchy and some of those command and control structures that we have, which can be a bit scary. I think higher education institutions are really poised to be able to rise to that challenge, because we are by nature sort of learning organisations. So let's just let ourselves be that, and get rid of some of that kind of very top-down kind of structures and governance that tends to be kind of get in the way of people getting on with it. So yes, I think it can be a challenge for smaller institutions who may not have the resources, but also those institutions actually have the ability probably to be a little bit more agile than some of the big sort of mammoth institutions. They might have less rigid governance, and so be able to empower and devolve change a bit more to the people who probably know how to do it. So I think we just need to ask a different question. I'm not sure it is that we should throw lots of resources there. Do it differently.
Great. Power's in our hands.
Yeah.
And that seems a suitable place to have some hands up. Who wants to ask a question of our excellent panel? One at the front here.
Thank you very much. I've got a question about, we've been talking a lot about individual institutions. I'm thinking about pulling this back to the kind of sector level and the consolidated position. The sector as a whole is planning to grow in student numbers and student number income. The OFS today has contacted accountable officers, highlighting a number of red flags around this. So there's a couple of statistics. Home student acceptances are up by 1.3% this year, but the sector had planned for 5.8%. The number of visas applied for by international students is down 16% year on year. So it's this idea that the sector as a whole, that its plans don't stack up against the data. I think the sector as a whole can cut costs, but my question to you guys is, can the sector as a whole grow? Is that realistic?
Yeah, really fascinating question. Can everyone win in this market? You look poised to say something, Sian. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was mulling this over. So Middlesex is in North London. 48% of 18-year-olds in London went into higher education this September. I look around, I know that 48% of young people in all the areas immediately around Middlesex did not go to university, and I know that we have transport links around us that mean that people who are living at home can get to Middlesex within under an hour. So I believe there's an untapped market there for Middlesex. So when I said it's a caveated yes, I think different universities will have different opportunities. I think that's an opportunity for us. And as an anchor institution, we will work with local schools and colleges and employers to maximise our local recruitment. And I think we can stabilise that. So that's not a sector answer, that's an answer for us. I think we have to reduce our reliance on clearing, because once we get to clearing, we are looking at students who could go anywhere in the country. So at that point, we are incredibly vulnerable. So for me, it's a change strategy to who do we recruit, how are they going to study with us, and how do we understand our relationship with our competitors. I don't think the whole sector can grow, but I think we do need to see ourselves as an ecosystem with other educational providers and with employers. So for employers, we could be offering micro-credentials that get people into the industry. We can be offering CPD to make that cost effective. I completely agree about apprenticeships. We can't be investing in activity which doesn't generate a margin in totality, but as long as you've got a portfolio that's locked together in a way that takes students through it and works with key employers, you would be generating a margin overall. So I think that's the question, rather than can the whole sector grow maybe. But I also think as long as we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, UK higher education will continue to be attractive internationally. We've got a new partnership with China. China wants to work with us because our art and design and innovation doesn't look like what China is offering at the moment. And I think they see the advantage of that. So I think we've still, back to the, are we out of time, are we out of road? Not yet. I think we've still got an international advantage if we play our cards right on it. So I think some institutions will grow, and I don't think the overall sector needs to contract.
But from what you're saying, Sian, there's a lot to be said for taking a demand-driven approach, working...
Understanding the demand in relation to our mission.
Exactly, absolutely. No, thank you. Anybody else want to come in on this one?
Just, this is a very ex-academic registrar answer, which is there's something in the numbers as well, because I think I've been involved in doing our annual financial return, which is where that date would have come from. I haven't seen the correspondence today, but some of that would have been an assumption that we're going to improve retention across the sector. And so the number of students within the sector could be larger without it necessarily meaning that there's a massive growth in the first years. And we often concentrate a lot on the first years and not on the continuing students when we talk about numbers, and they are 2/3 of our numbers. So there is an opportunity. I think there is genuinely, like Sian said, an opportunity still internationally. I think there's going to be a massively growing middle class in India. Nigeria is going to be the largest population in 30 years. I think there are still opportunities, and I agree. I think UK PLC is still attractive, but I do also recognise that I'm sitting here as a senior manager saying that, and so we can, in terms of sending that AFR in, you can be overly optimistic. So I think the OFS challenge back to us is right, but I wouldn't assume that all that growth for numbers is necessarily people saying they're going to grow their first years.
Excellent, thank you. Right, I'm going back to the floor. Any more questions?
Firstly, the comment about apprenticeships, just music to my ears. But the first and secondly, I wanted to say, yes, do invest in your change managers, because if you want to do anything quickly, they're the people that will help you do that. But I'm just sort of sat here and all the conversations we've had today, and I'm just thinking we're being very reactive. It feels reactive. We're full of a room of planners, and I'll be slightly careful in my question, but my question is, how have we got to the point of being on a precipice? Which is what it feels like, and we're responding to the fact that we are on that precipice. And could we have done, but hindsight is a beautiful thing, but could we have done something that we're not there and we're not having this conversation?
Really interesting question, Jess. Sian?
Was the question, is the whole sector on the back foot, or is there another way of imagining it?
Are we on the precipice? Are we on the precipice? Have we got to
Okay. So financially, that is the case. There'll be a lot of universities with loans that could be in breach of it if the lenders called them in. I don't know how many universities that would be, but I imagine it would be a third to a half, actually. I don't think that will happen, and I think that's because, if I go back to what do we need in the long term, so Middlesex sits in an area with 4 million people around us. They will need nurses, police officers, teachers, social workers. That's not going to go away. Even if they're provided for differently, it won't go away. Even if the NHS contracted and private health grew, which I don't think will happen now under this government in the way we thought it might under the previous government. But I think there will be a need for degree qualified public sector workers around us. So for me, that is an irreducible core. And I think the overall, the country cannot afford to lose half its higher education. But I do think, as I said, we're autonomous institutions. We borrowed that money. And the rules are the same as your own mortgage. So we have to be very, very proactive now about navigating the financial challenges of that and looking at our costs, as we've heard, and thinking about why should we be here in the future and how does that mission work for the country, not for us. And that means a lot of culturally very challenging questions about the people who maybe feel they've got a right to do things in the way they used to do things. I don't think we have that right. I think higher education is needed and graduates are needed, but a lot of the way we operate isn't completely aligned with that need. So I think we have to get our own house in order and then be in a position to negotiate with government if some of those on that edge of that financial precipice. But I agree, financially, that is where we are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's a lady at the front.
So I'm Lindsay from the University of Sunderland in London, so we're a London satellite campus. We've talked a lot on the panel about cutting bureaucracy and streamlining, but we're facing ever-growing bureaucracy and regulation from externals. It started with the Home Office back in 2009, and now the OFS, E6 being the most recent regulation. How do we square the circle of making us more streamlined within this world of regulation?
Who wants to go for this one?
Yeah,
Sharon.
sure.
Sharon.
Yeah, I think it's a real issue because we've got to own the autonomy. I agree, we can't have it always, and certainly going back just to the previous question, if you talk about how hard it is at home, everyone rolls their eyes. They don't care, do they? And I can't believe it. That it's been hard in a lot of places for a long time. And if you mention it and you've got somebody in your family that's a midwife or a nurse or a doctor or whatever, they're looking at you like you're mad. And so we've got to solve it ourselves because there is no cavalry coming, I don't think. And so we've got to take control. But the other side of autonomy is that we're very regulated. Again, I'm sure there's other areas that are as regulated as us, but I think that we are seen to be, I think someone mentioned it earlier in one of the sessions I was in, we can be on the bad side of both sides of that. So when the government wants us to step into line, they'll do another, what we're going to be, Z6 at some point, and the other side, when they're having to be fiscally prudent, we're autonomous, and I think that is a very difficult circle square, but we know that whatever they throw at us, we've always been able to adapt and to meet those things. Some of the stuff, I think when we've had the freedom of information stuff, some of it got caught up in a bit of the culture wars, and you kind of hope that some of that stuff is starting to ease back maybe. Should we have done more about sexual harassment, about power relationships in universities before, rather than having to be mandated to do it? Maybe that kind of comes back to us taking control. I'm not sure it's the right way to go about it through regulation all the time when we're autonomous, but what it does mean is I'm sure you've all done a lot of work around this, and I think that we do miss a trick. We were talking to SUMS about it actually, and to I was with AHUA, which is my sector body, last week, and we were saying this is where some people could really step into the space. So if something like AHUA said, okay, we've got this coming now from the government, let's work together on it, because we've all got our own legal teams and our own policy teams all working on it. If there was just a template that you could then make, I'd make it hearts. Somebody else said, you know, and you look at it in your own context, but if there was a blueprint that we could work together on and take it off the shelf, in the same way as I know someone earlier mentioned about a sector-wide student record system, or at least a sector-wide operating model, there are some things that we could really do to help each other that none of us have really got to grips with.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. I'm going to take one more from the floor before I just explore another couple of areas with the panel. Anybody got a question? Okay, right. Whilst you're thinking, I'm going to go back with a couple of particular themes. So I'm really interested, Sian, in research, because we've barely talked about that today. But I'm conscious that when universities undertake activity-based costing exercises, often at the start of a TOM process or a financial review, you know before you've started that research doesn't wash its face. But it's still an essential part of the three-legged stool, isn't it? It's core to us being universities. So how do you reconcile that? How do you justify cross-subsidisation in what is a very cost-constrained scenario?
So you're obviously going to look more carefully at what doesn't make a margin when you're really under pressure. But as we've already said, I think lots of university activities generate a loss, and the important thing is that you're looking at your activity as a whole. So different disciplines, different levels of study and different awards generate different margins and have different costs. So my view on this is that we have a stewardship for a mission, and therefore so for example, arts and creative industries is incredibly challenging financially. I think if we're a local institution, an anchor institution, it's the right of local people to be able to study art and design and have careers in art and design. And so we absolutely have to cross-subsidise while being as efficient as possible. Doesn't let us off the hook on efficiency, but it does mean that we accept that some subjects have greater costs, but that doesn't mean we're not going to offer them. In terms of HE, I think it's a vital part of the HE ecosystem, and I'm going to give an example from nursing. Nursing evolves, and we educate graduates who are lifelong learners and will be working in a profession that will be changing. And when we do research in that area and we talk to health providers, part of the offer, part of the partnership is that we help them see the future of that profession, and we help shape that future. We shape it by graduates who can go in and be part of it, and we shape it because we are supporting professional doctorates in it. We would be very much lessened if we didn't do that, and I would argue for us doing that. But we have to know, my view is we have to know what it costs, and we have to be able to make a financial plan that recognises that, so I haven't got the data on our apprenticeships, I haven't got the data on our professional doctorates, but I'm pretty sure what it's going to tell us is we make a loss on both of them, and we would see them as part of a mixed economy of provision that overall has to turn a margin, has to turn a profit.
Okay, thank you. Now, really important that we don't forget activities like that. You know, it's never in the mix when we're talking about income diversification. I want to turn to a different theme, and one that will resonate, I'm sure, with everybody in the room, and that's the reality that equality, or equity, perhaps more importantly, equity, diversity and inclusion are values that our institutions and us as practitioners all hold dear. They underpin our institutions. They're important to both the cost cutting, but also the income diversification, the opportunities side of the coin. How can we ensure that the decisions that we make and the opportunities that we provide have equity built into them, so that on our transformation journeys we are getting the diversity of experience, the diversity of thought that makes our institutions so special? I'm probably going to turn to you first, Aya, on this as a change practitioner, and then I'll run down the line because I'm sure there's things everyone wants to say on this.
So I guess first I'd just like to reflect that as a sector in the UK, We do it really well compared to some other places. So I've recently worked in universities in Denmark, and EDI is not even, I mean, it's a glimmer in someone's eye. It's really 20 years behind, I would say. So there's something about recognising that actually there's a really good foundation to build on. And then I wonder whether it's about looking at some other sectors who have got there, so where they can absolutely demonstrate that encouraging diversity and making sure you have a really diverse workforce is adding to the bottom line, because that's the bit that will make the difference. And there are companies out there that do that. There's also lots of boardrooms where it's all middle-aged white males. But there are some companies who've got it right, and I wonder whether we look outside the sector to sort of pick those bright spots and learn from those, rather than looking internally, because we've not nailed it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aya. Anybody else want to comment on this?
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely crucial and it is about that diversity of thought, because you can do as much training and you can really step forward and lean into this stuff. I do on the EDI lead for the university and really try to step forward to it. But it's not the same as lived experience. It just isn't. So you can have empathy, but you can't have lived that experience. So we just have to do better. We just simply have to, and that's right through again from the top. So governance recruitment, senior leadership team recruitment, all the way through, and building the pipeline to help that.
Yeah.
We should be ashamed of ourselves. Actually, it's a bit like the awarding gap. It's just not acceptable, and we have to honestly say that.
Not acceptable. Excellent, thank you. Sian, what she said, absolutely. Excellent. Right, I'm coming back to the floor. We've probably got time for another couple of questions from delegates. Anybody got one? I've got loads if you haven't, but just want to give you the opportunity whilst we have the panel in front of us. Helen.
I'm struck by the fact that obviously we are talking about costs, but equally when you talked about loss-making activities, we're back to the fact that finance is just the one way that we are now being encouraged to judge what we do and the value of what we do. To what extent should the sector be fighting back against some of this and trying to actually put the agenda back into, we know not everything we do is profitable, but we plan for it and this is what we're doing and we believe that our role is bigger than that. And it maybe comes back to some of the OFS regulation questions as well.
Philosophical, moral point being made there. Anybody got any thoughts on this? Sian, you look poised again.
Could you summarise it for me?
Yes, sorry. We've talked a great deal about finance today, but to what extent should we as a sector be pushing back to government in particular and saying, actually, because of the inherent importance of higher education as a public good, particularly to fund research, particularly to fund critical areas of education that don't wash their faces, should we receive more central government funding? That's the key question.
I was reverse mentoring a black nurse at Kettering Hospital when I was at Northampton. So I went to her and I went around Kettering Hospital, and I no longer thought that higher education was underfunded. I think we are way at the back of the queue. I think you could go around all sorts of public sector organisations that are equally vital to life in the UK, and they have been hit harder on funding than we have.
Reality check.
I don't argue at all with the fact we're a public good. We're absolutely a public good. But so is early years education. I would put the money in early years education first.
Yeah.
But probably also, if we spend our time trying to argue with government that we should be better funded, that's time away from actually how do we deal with the reality that we have now. So let's just accept that that is the reality and figure out how we together tackle it, because otherwise we'll be another few years down the line.
Yes, and indeed, government has said, we've got your number. They've said, we know you're inefficient now. They've kind of known it for a long time, but this is the first time they've really said, if you don't get better, if you don't reform, you're not going to get anything more.
And we know they've read the O'Brien Act to the NHS as well. We're not, we're not the
Yeah,
only ones.
absolutely, absolutely. So drive trains and you'll be all right, but that's a... Okay, any more questions from the floor? Right, I'm just going to explore another couple of things before we close the session. First off, there's this wonderful phrase that as a sector, we are wonderful midwives and terrible undertakers. When we do stop-start continues, we don't stop anything. How can we make those tough decisions? How can we stop doing things that we have started at some point and possibly don't need anymore? How do we make those decisions? Sian?
So one of the things I observe with portfolios is they expand like the universe. And every time they do that, the elements of them get more and more relatively expensive. So I don't have a vision of us only offering 10 courses. I don't think that would work. But I do think we have to reverse the forces on the portfolio. We have to make it leaner, cleaner. We have to be able to use managerial time to monitor whether our students are continuing and whether they're having a good experience in a way that we don't as it expands. So we have to reverse the institutional forces on it. And I agree as well with Sharon that committees where things get discussed but the people in the room are not executive are an absolute problem. You cannot make a decision on behalf of somebody else. You need the person who's going to own the decision in the room making the decision, and that's it. So I think you could have a much, much leaner governance model right through your university.
Excellent, thank you.
But you need to think about how you bring people on board. I've been at universities that took out all its committees. Nobody knew what was going on. There was no connective tissue. Nobody talked to anybody.
Yeah.
So what you need to recognise is that the committee has a function of bringing people together, of succession planning and talent management, that it's an opportunity for people. You have to replace those opportunities. You can't just eradicate them. So you think, how do we communicate? How do people grow? How do they know what's going on? But you need something much more systematic than our very ad hoc cottage industry approach.
A good phrase to use, I think. Aya, you're a change practitioner. Stop, start, continue is an exercise you do in your sleep.
Yeah, but nobody listens. I think it probably comes back to what you talked about, sort of portfolio approach, but from a change perspective. So senior leaders often will buy into a portfolio and they'll say, yes, we need to make sure that they all go together and we shouldn't try and do everything. But they say the right things and they don't make those decisions, particularly because some of the things that might have to be stopped are their own pet projects, right? So for me, it's about the leadership having a joint vision and making those sacrifices and saying, and that means I'm not going to get my new CRM or I'm not going to get my whatever it is that isn't aligned around the user experience. And maybe, I'd love to see a shift in HE where boards or councils or courts or whatever the body that's holding senior leadership to account is called, where the KPIs and targets that they set are much more nuanced and based around the user and kind of challenge HEIs to prioritise and actually stop some activities. So we all say it, but very few institutions actually do it. So if what you measure is what happens, right? That's the action that happens. So until our measures reflect the wish to do fewer things better, I don't think it'll change.
Okay, and again, it's about connectivity and the right governance structures, the right metrics and KPIs in order to achieve that. Okay, we've only got time for one final question. I'm going to throw this at Sharon to start with, and really it's that user experience piece that I'm coming back to. When we review these things, we normally start off with a business case, and then we think about how it'll impact on our staffing bodies when we do change. How do we make sure that students and other key external stakeholder groups are factored into the thinking when we're going on the change curve?
Yeah, I think it is challenging because we were just talking about trying to be leaner and quicker, and I think that the more collaboration and the more consultation we do goes against that, and I think that's kind of a natural state for a university is to be consultative and collaborative. So it's almost a dichotomy. It's getting the right people in the room and allowing them to speak. So at Herts, like many other universities, we would have students on all of our main committees. But I have to be honest, it can be pretty arbitrary. It's quite difficult for them. They're often SABs. They're coming for 1 year, 2 years. how do you mentor them to be effective? You know, do we kind of nod and say well done and then kind of move on anyway? So to have that real partnership and to make sure we're really hearing their voice. Likewise with the NHS, for example, with others, we bring them in and we can say, yeah, we've spoken to them. But how you do that meaningfully is a challenge when it's really a matrix of decisions across many other areas, and they will be focused on one particular bit of it. So I think you have to find the bit that's really meaningful for them and ask them the questions that are really going to make a difference for them, rather than involving them in perhaps the whole project, and be much more honest about why you're doing that.
And when you drill into those more meaningful elements, so you're asking them narrower questions, or questions across a narrower scope, I'm assuming that their voice gets it is louder. It's got more potency. It has more to say in that space. You'll take it into greater account. Is that right?
You'd hope so, but it's also an issue that's one student. So if
you're
talking to the president of the issue, they're going to come at it from a particular perspective, and the mandate that they've come in on. In the end, they're running a parliament in effect. They've come in on a mandate. So, so you have to. There has to be some breadth for that voice as well.
Yeah.
Not a single. Can't be a single view. And I think it is challenging. You want to make a decision quickly. You want to be agile in it, and you want to speak to everybody.
Just don't have the scope, exactly. And the last word goes to Sian.
I was going to say, if you've got a hierarchy of projects, your most important projects, you invest the most in talking to students and stakeholders. And so I did a big transformation project. We had students working on the project team. We employed them.
You employed them?
We employed students
Excellent.
on the project team alongside project managers and leaders and change managers. So we wouldn't do that for everything.
Yeah.
But where it really mattered, we put a huge amount of investment, because we said it's not going to work if we don't have those voices. The normal way of doing it it's not effective, so we will invest in this project and we will invest in stakeholder voice.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I hope you found that as interesting as I have. Lots of great insights, some great ideas, and case studies there from three tremendous speakers. So please join me in thanking Sharon Harrison Barker, Professor Sian Waring, and Aya Ferguson for what has been a terrific hour.